Hey, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mitch Taco Bell. I'm your host for Tall Tales with Taco. In kind of a continuing theme of exposure on some of the issues I have with the military and things that are troubling me in terms of our future readiness, I am bringing on tonight a very special guest. Matt Lohmeier is a former Air Force Lieutenant Colonel, F-15 pilot, commander of a Space Force Squadron, and I think I got that right, and was relieved from his job over controversy with what he experienced in his time looking at Marxism and how it's kind of evolved in our military. He's written a book, highly recommend, Irresistible Revolution. It is something that the first half of the book, you're going to be going, okay, here's the in-depth knowledge and breakdown of how Marxism started and communism around the world. And then in the middle of the book, it gets right into what it's done to our military. And without further ado, I'd like to bring Matt on. Matt, how are you, sir?
Taco, doing pretty well, thanks.
Yeah, and everybody, let me put this up. Matt is also the host of, there we go. Matt is also the host of the Matt Lohmeier Show, which you can find on YouTube. Like it, subscribe, check it out. It's going to have some really interesting interviews in there. And of course, Matt looks like my old G.I. Joe with his full beard now. But you're lucky. I can't grow that kind of stuff. It comes in patchy. But you look great. You survived the Air Force and all the trauma and stuff that's gone on in there. But do me a favor, take us back to how this whole thing started. And I found it interesting. It almost goes back to when you went to an upper level school and you were writing your thesis. So go back for us for the folks that have never heard of you, seen you, know zip. Let's go back to F-15 pilot. We'll start there. Air Force Academy grad, F-15 pilot. How about that?
Yeah, sure. And about the beard, I've been waiting 22 years to grow this beard. And now that I can get away with not shaving, I've been taking advantage of it for the better part of the last 8 or 9 months. But yeah,
Well,
I started the Air Force Academy in 2000.
Yeah.
And anyone that's aware of how life at the service academies works realizes that you give away a lot of your freedoms when you show up at one of our service academies. At least you used to. I imagine it's still, roughly speaking, the same way. But there were no cell phones or iPhones back then. I remember going into the phone room at the end of the hallway in my squadron in the Vandenberg Tower at the Air Force Academy, where you could use a payphone to call home on the weekends. And when you went down to the end of the hallway, I think there were probably 2 phone booths there.
Yeah.
And so if there were 2 cadets already in there calling home to mama, then you had to sit out in the hall and wait your turn. Things have changed, I think, quite dramatically. Everyone's got cell phones now, maybe not basic, but give them back to them when they finish.
Oh, dude, the whole school. I went to go visit a couple years ago. My neighbor graduated. He's an F-16 kid and Aviano, so I'd have a layover in Colorado Springs, call him up. Yes, sir, I'll be there in a minute. He'd come pick me and my FO up. We'd go to the academy, go drink beer at the little bar you have.
Yeah.
And I walk out and I see this Domino's Pizza golf cart just zipping around campus. I'm like,
man,
wait, what? Yeah, we got Domino's downstairs. They deliver.
That's amazing.
So a lot's changed, I think, since you've been there.
Yeah, so I got into the academy because I was good at basketball, not because I was good at academics. That changed at some point when I started to take schooling seriously. I just hadn't taken academics very seriously in high school, I suppose. I was too busy doing other fun things.
Yeah.
But when I graduated from the Air Force Academy, I went off to Vance Air Force Base in Oklahoma and was a student pilot there and really had ambitions to fly the A-10. And
good airplane. I like that.
It is. It's been around a while. Trusty A-10 was the top of my dream sheet, and that didn't happen. I ended up being chosen to stay put at Vance and be a T-38 instructor pilot. And I faped. I was excited about that. And it turned out that was just a very good option for me. I was single at the time. While I was there as a FAPE, got married to my wife, who I'm still married to. We've been married for 11 years.
Oh,
And
fantastic. Couple
she had,
kids.
yeah, a couple kids now, a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old. My wife at the time was involved in very successful real estate development firm out in Washington, D.C., and she moved to Enid, Oklahoma. So I know she really loved me. I think she still does, despite everything that's happened.
Uh,
So it was only after acquiring 1,000 hours as an instructor pilot in the T-38 that I was selected to go fly the F-15.
cool
And
airplane.
it is. And, the C model, single seat air-to-air superiority fighter, wouldn't have traded it for anything in the world. It was, it wasn't my first choice. And then I got it and I thought, man, I love flying at altitude, looking outside of the cockpit and doing the air-to-air mission strictly because you get to become an expert in one thing. And so I ended up at Kadena in Japan.
Okay.
The B course for the F-15 when I went through was in Klamath Falls, Oregon, which was great. It was a guard unit that did the basic course for the F-15, and then was stationed at Japan right after that. And I ended up being medically separated from the flying community after that first year in the F-15, which is how I got into the space career field.
Oh, no kidding.
And at the time, so I accumulated about 1,200 hours of flying time. Didn't do my full extended. Shouldn't call it extended. I didn't do the full 3 years at Kadena. I left after the first year, and a decision was put to me, and it was, if you're not going to be flying a single seat air-to-air fighter, what career field do you go into? And I had a list of options in front of me, and one of them was, at the time, it was the space career field, and
Right.
it was Air Force Space Command. And I didn't know anything about space. I thought that was just all NASA stuff. As a fighter pilot, you're kind of just, especially a new fighter pilot, you're not really fully integrated into like the breadth of your own service even. You're just learning about your
Sure.
platform and becoming an expert in the platform. And I had the fortune of having a next door neighbor move in there at Kadena, who is the only space officer at Kadena Air Base and happened to be my next door neighbor. And
Do you have
so
special wings?
yeah, he had the Spings, the space wings. And they were like a mockery of the pilot wings because they looked kind of similar, but you
Right.
had to look closely and squint and realize there was something different. But I sat down with him and I said, I'd like to ask you a bunch of questions about your career field because I've got the opportunity to pick a career field right now. And I've never really learned anything about space. What is it that you're doing there? And he said, oh, it's terrible. Here's what I hate about space. I hate about space. I hate about space. And it was all stuff that was like prose to me. He was stationed in Colorado Springs and Denver, Colorado. He said, I just couldn't get out of Colorado. My wife and I have been there for 6 years. And I thought,
Yeah.
man, that's awesome. My wife and I love Colorado. Having gone to the
Red Rock
academy. Yeah,
concerts.
Red Rock.
Go down Air
Red
Force
Rock.
Academy football games. Yeah.
Yeah, so we my wife's from the Springs originally, and the thought of being stationed in Colorado had never even been a thought we'd entertained because you don't get stationed in Colorado as an F-15C pilot. And
Sure.
and the thought that there was a career field that seemed to us to be kind of the pointy edge of the spear, so to speak, that could bring us right back home to Colorado, that was pretty exciting. So we ended up leaning space. I selected space, and space selected me.
What year was this?
This was 2012.
Okay.
2012 to 13 time frame is when I transitioned into space.
And when did they actually set up the Space Command as another branch?
Okay, so I'll be careful how I use the terms here because there have been and are different organizations that go by very similar names.
Right.
And so there was a Space Command that was then, I don't want to say dismantled, but it was effectively stood down. And I don't remember when that was, but we're talking like a couple decades ago. It was stood down. And then there was an Air Force Space Command. So all of our space-based capabilities like GPS and space-based missile warning and strategic communication satellites were all a part of the Department of the Air Force and its budget. But there was a MAGCOM within the Department of the Air Force Space Command. I'm sorry. Yeah, Air Force Space Command that had a 4-star general in charge of that MAGCOM. And then there began to be talks about whether or not there should be an independent branch of the military, which is what you're asking about, for space. And about the same time that the Trump administration decides to write into Title 10 the law that there would be a new service, which isn't the president's decision, by the way. That was a bipartisan vote of the Congress that makes it law. There was also a separate entity that was established called U.S. Space Command. Okay, so I'll disambiguate the two for you. U.S. Space Command, not Air Force Space Command. U.S. Space Command is a combatant command that has another 4-star military officer. At the time it was set up, it was General Dickinson. He was an Army 4-star who had a lot of experience in the Missile Defense Agency. He was in charge. He was placed in charge of the U.S. Space Command, which was like U.S. Strategic Command that General John Hyten was in charge of at the time that this was set up. That was in charge of nuclear weapons. We had geographic combatant commands like the Indo-PACOM, the Indo-Pacific Command. You had EUCOM, you had CENTCOM. All of these geographic combatant commands have 4-star generals or admirals that oversee them, that are responsible for the warfighting function of our military. But you have the military branches, the services, Air Force, Marine Corps, Navy, and Army, and Space Force. They have a mission that is not warfighting, but it's actually training and equipping our warfighters. And so the idea was, not only will there be a combatant command responsible for warfighting in, from, and through space, U.S. Space Command, but we'd have a separate branch of the military, U.S. Space Force, and they toyed around with the naming convention. It was either going to be the Space Corps or the Space Force. It ended up being the Space Force. And that new branch of the military, the U.S. Space Force, would be responsible for training and equipping, that's the phrase that they use, our service members to do that particular mission, to use the capabilities. But in a wartime scenario,
sure,
they would be working also for the U.S. Space Command to wage conflict, not U.S. Space Force. And so, the Air Force doesn't wage conflict. Air Force persons and assets wage conflict in a particular theater when under the direction of a combatant commander. So if I haven't muddied the waters completely
how about
in
the
that
TV
explanation.
You're going to get hit with all the memes and stuff, but how about
Yeah.
the TV show? Do you ever watch the Space Force and laugh?
This week I watched Despicable Me with my kids, and my wife reminded us that the voice of Gru, the big bald-headed, strange-looking guy in Despicable Me with all the minions, that's what's his name? Steve Carell.
Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say Michael Scott. I've got The Office running through my head. Michael Scott. It's Michael Scott. It's Steve Carell, and he does a phenomenal job with Gru. I don't think he does a phenomenal job as the commander of the Space Force. It's kind of a dud, in my opinion. Didn't get great reviews. And
it's on Netflix or something. You can watch it. I did get laughs out of it because I like him as an actor, as a comedic actor. But as much as a Marine, as much grief as we give the Air Force, my first question to you would be, which department's in charge of building the golf courses and the BOQs on the moon? Which department do I get in to get the contract for that?
Yeah. Steve Carell's great. But one of the misperceptions that people have about the Space Force was that it's Trump's Space Force. And in one manner of speaking, I suppose he deserves a great deal of credit, because he and Vice President Pence had enough interest in the idea to make it reality. And so, Vice President Pence he's a space junkie. He's a space nerd, and is a champion of all things space. And so you had the right combination of people to take a bold idea that was not a new idea, and it certainly wasn't Trump's idea. It's been around for decades. In fact, if you go back and read Cold War era, both science fiction as well as serious literature, academic literature about space power theory, and some of the space ambitions that some experts had even 40 and 50 years ago, they're already talking about maybe having a separate branch of the military that's a steward of that domain, and they considered it potentially its own domain, as different from the air domain as the air domain is from the sea domain. But there was, and this is an important point, there was something in 1999 called the Rumsfeld Report that essentially said the Air Force wasn't exactly the best steward of our space capabilities and budget. And so there was very serious conversation then, over 2 decades ago now, about the possibility of establishing an independent branch of the military, but 9/11 happened. And we got involved in endless conflict over in the Middle East and in the deserts, and that really dropped off of the radar for many of our senior policymakers. And it wasn't until the Trump-Pence administration that that we have an administration that's willing to put their foot forward and take action. And there were two, I think, predominantly two congressmen that are deserving of attention for keeping the conversation alive. One was a Democrat, one was a Republican. Democrat Jim Cooper in Tennessee and Republican Mike Rogers in Alabama. They were kind of tied at the hip and pushing for the idea of an independent Space Corps. And when Trump announced it, I just can't imagine. I bet they about died because they thought it was going to kill the idea forever.
Yeah.
Because you'd have this partisan split that would prevent it from being voted into law, and it went through.
So going back to Okinawa, when you're sitting there at Gate 2 Street, going into Oshi Sushi or whatever.
Yeah.
Their neighbor that just left Space Force.
He was
the same
still
command. Is this guy? You went into the same Space Force or Space Command in Denver? Okay. Did it change?
No. So he was still a space officer,
right?
But what that meant was that he was a part of Air Force Space Command at the time. This is back in 2012.
Okay.
And so he was the sole space advisor to the base commander at Kadena and would go into uber top secret meetings with the base commander to let him know what was happening with the space and I shouldn't say more environment there locally that would be pertinent to the flying mission that we were doing out of Kadena and other special operations that were going on. And of course, you picture where Okinawa is. It's about 400 miles south of the southern tip of Japan, close to Taiwan, right across from China. And it's right in the Indo-PACOM region, and it's it's a hotbed of activity, and it was even back then, a decade ago. It's surely more so now.
Yeah. All right, so that makes sense now. So you go into Space Command, and no matter what you call it, they need good leadership, and they need officers in the program. So you get selected, which quite an honor. And you go in, and now you're the commanding officer of an air defense. Was it an air defense battery?
A little bit different. So, yeah, I come into the space community, and I'm not a commander right away. I come in right after flying, and I'm in the Air Force Space Command community. Mm-hmm. And the job that I get assigned to do and in which I get training is space-based missile warning. We have two different types, roughly speaking. We've got two different types of missile warning we do. One is a ground-based missile warning. We've got these giant radars that'll fry your flesh off if you get in front of them, that are all up along the northern latitudes of Alaska and North United States and all the way over into Western Europe. And that early warning line was set up during the Cold War to watch for intercontinental ballistic missile launches coming over the North Pole. But we then thereafter also established a space-based architecture using infrared satellites that could also detect those launches even earlier.
And launches and go, right, yeah.
So that was my career field. And after doing that and then going off and getting a master's degree and then another master's degree in one of the DoD strategy schools, I came out of there into command of what was now a Space Force squadron, because the Space Force had been created during the Trump administration and while I was at school, and in fact had been an aide-de-camp for General J. Raymond, who's now still the chief of space operations for that new space service. And so got to listen in on, and I won't say participate, that's giving myself too much credit, but be present for many conversations about the pros and cons of that new branch of the military that Trump had initiated.
Okay. The first time that you saw stuff going kind of haywire, in your opinion, could you trace that back to your time at the academy? Because I know that my neighbor's kid talked about it was the first gay female general superintendent, all these first. Yeah. They got the witches, whatever, have their own burn a whatever their own little thing up
Yeah,
there at the
right.
academy. All these weird witch religion or whatever you call them. I don't even know.
Hmm.
Druids, not even druids, but anyway,
Yeah,
witches and all this weird stuff.
you're probably getting all those names apply, and they're all a part of the new. I mean, yeah, whether it's Druid or witchcraft or Wiccan
Yeah,
uh,
Wiccan, that was it. And so they
or
got their own religious
yeah.
deal up on the side of the mountain, then go up there and burn whatever. Um, so the changes that from when you were there, did you witness that kind of changing when you were there, or was it still fairly normal? Patriotic, love the country, proud to serve, not the stuff that they're kind of getting now.
What we're seeing happen now is extremely different than my entire time in the service, and things are radically changing very quickly. And what I mean by that, of course, there was always a political activist or someone whose views were a bit radical. That wasn't really apparent because we really largely kept politics out of the
Yeah.
workspace. Identity politics wasn't a part of our military. And we did a really good job taking seriously the obligation to be apolitical as a service. And so you had Republicans and Democrats and anything in between. I wasn't even necessarily political myself until the last 10 years of my life. I just never paid attention to that kind of thing. But my sense is that you had a great mix, just like you do today, of people running around with different views. Of course, not as ideologically wed as they are today. And no one really knew because you had a mission you focused on and everyone was focused on that. And they went home and they ruined people's lives and their private lives, maybe with their stupid views, but they didn't ruin the workplace with their stupid views.
And we didn't have social media as well.
Social media has been a big factor. Yeah, there are a number of factors that have led to where we're at today. The way we educate our force, we pride ourselves in Ivy League institutions to educate our senior military leaders. And there was even a purge of sorts during the last Obama administration of senior leaders who seemed to have the wrong political views. But that was relatively transparent to the force. So to answer your question, I serve all these years in the military. Over 15 in the end after graduating from the Air Force Academy, and never really did I have concerns about identity politics, wokeism, either radical leftism or a strong-armed conservatism somehow fundamentally shaping the culture of the military. It just wasn't a thing. But I went off to school at Air Command and Staff College in Alabama.
And that was Maxwell. Was that
Maxwell.
Where you first in the book you talk about writing your thesis and you go before the board to give your idea?
Yep. Okay, so I get a master's degree at Air Command and Staff College, and then usually people go back to various bases throughout the world and they take their next assignment. And I stayed around for an extra year in a different education program. It's called the School of Advanced Air and Space Studies, which is the reference that you're pointing to from the book. And it was in that second master's program on military strategy, where we deep dived Cold War history and where I wrote that thesis that I describe in the book, that I encountered. Let me say this up front. I don't do this often enough. The faculty at SAS is phenomenal. I think it was second to none. I mean, just excellent people, really great thinkers. We'd read a book a day and we'd show up every day for 2 hours and argue with one another. We'd learn how to argue respectfully with one another about a different viewpoint. And what's amazing is that you can have 10 leaders sitting around the table, having read the same book the previous day, and all show up having taken away such different information, having processed it so differently. It just goes to show. By the way, let me add this in. Didn't matter if there are 12 white guys in the room or 12 black guys in the room. You don't have to have racial diversity to come up with diversity of thought, period. That's just stupid. You can have people of the same household, raised by the same parents, show up and read that book and all come away with wildly different ideas about what was important and what wasn't, and disagree with one another about how that has any application to our life as leaders in the military. So the whole diversity industry, by the way, is fueled by a great number of lies. And one of them is that you need to ensure racial diversity to get diversity of thought. That's stupid. That's just not a thing. Okay. Now, of course, people of different backgrounds bring different views to the table. No one argues with that. But anyway, back to the strategy school. It was while I was there and was presenting an idea for my thesis that I ran into considerable pushback because I mentioned the name Jordan Peterson.
Right.
But I was using a philosophical framework that he had created in one of his books, in a much earlier book that most Americans have never heard of, called Maps of Meaning. It was written in 1999, and it's deep, it's philosophical, and it's marvelous. I mean, it's just, and then he became much more famous 2 decades later when he writes 12 Rules for Life and publicly pushes back against compelled speech, and in this case, using being forced to use someone's preferred pronouns.
And when you gave this, was he as famous at that time?
Well,
or did you just happen to find it?
Well, he had become famous. I don't remember how I think I had a professor from the previous year who's a great space thinker recommend the 1999 book Maps of Meaning to me. Said, I think you'd really enjoy this. So I bought it and I read it very carefully, and I did really enjoy it. But it was in using that philosophical framework that I have this really negative encounter. I'm briefing my classmates and some of the faculty, not all of the faculty. And there was some female civilian faculty that had been hired, and they begin whispering to one another as I'm giving my presentation. They cut me off. And one of them, who is the active duty officer, turns and says to the civilian faculty member, do you want to tell him or do you want me to tell him? And then they inform me and the whole rest of the class that it's so inappropriate of me to use any of Jordan Peterson's material for anything academic that I'm doing. By the way, phenomenal academic and one of the greatest intellectuals we've got in Western society at the moment.
Oh, yeah.
Whether you agree with all of his views or not. Yeah. So she then said, to quote Jordan Peterson for your paper is like using Hitler in your research paper as a foundation of your paper, which is totally bogus. I was blown away. And it just goes to show you they hadn't studied Jordan Peterson.
Right.
They had read a few leftist headlines that they were parroting and made him out to be an enemy. So that turned into something over the next few months where, again, the same professor, by the way, corrected one of the female lieutenant colonels in our class because she referred to manned space flight in one of her presentations, and she was cut off. And this female professor said, it's not manned anything. There's no man anymore. It's crewed space flight. Crew. It's a crew. There's no manned space flight. There's no manpower. There's personnel. There's crew power. And you need to get rid of this man jargon out of your language because it's so offensive.
It's not a cockpit. It's a flight deck.
Yeah, it's not a cockpit.
Station.
So, that was I haven't spent time in academia for a very long time up until that point. And the Air Force Academy that I'd attended just wasn't really like that when I was there 20 years ago. And so I experienced this and I'm troubled. I thought, what is the deal? Like, I thought this existed at a few universities around the country. How is this in our premier strategy school?
And of course, if you pursue it, you're going to get an F, even though it felt good and you did it right because you bucked in the system.
Well, I did.
And on the other hand, did you acquiesce and find another avenue?
Well, here's the interesting thing. Let me be clear about what I wrote about. Let me try and remember what I wrote about. Okay. So I was exploring why, as an institution, the Department of the Air Force had some kind of cultural resistance to the idea of an independent branch of the military for space. What were the barriers, and were some of them cultural rather than practical or budgetary or some of? And so the framework that I got from Maps of Meaning, which was all about the undergirdings of culture and what it is that shapes culture, is what I was interested in using from. I wasn't interested in like quoting Jordan Peterson all throughout my thesis. I was using a framework that I got out of one of his earlier works. Right. I was gonna explore the Space Force Air Force debate, not talk about Jordan Peterson, but I was just so shocked, and I explained that in my presentation. So I was shocked at their pushback, and that was kind of my first introduction to the idea that we have a problem with essentially, I'll put it this way. I mean, left-wing ideologues are now shaping the academic institutions to which our military is I'm going to restate that because it's not to which they are subjected. Left-wing ideologues, just like they make up a great percentage of academic institutions all around the country, they're also coming to really shape the culture of the academic institutions of the military. Our service academies, West Point, Annapolis, the Air Force Academy, the U.S. Coast Guard. We just had 7 cadets kicked out of the Coast Guard 2 weeks ago because they refused the vaccine. They're being prevented from graduating, even though some of them are in their last year at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. One of them ended up homeless, in fact, and they were asked to pay with their own money to go find a place to live or find their way back home to mom and dad. I mean, but that's senior military leadership decision. Let me get back to the heart of the matter, and it's this. You asked about when I start to notice this.
Mm-hmm.
So I mentioned my experience there at that strategy school in my book, but it's when I come out of that strategy school into command of a squadron in our new Space Force that I was blown away by the left-wing activism that was occurring at a base in Colorado that I was assigned to be in command at. Now, not every base was having that problem systemically, so to speak, at the same time that I was experiencing it, but I came into command in June of 2020, and COVID was now energetically underway, and people were still unsure about what all that meant, of course, and so I can understand some of the precaution there. But George Floyd had been killed the month prior. Okay. And we didn't yet have a Secretary of Defense come in and say that white nationalism was one of the biggest problems we're facing from a national security perspective. But the Air Force was conducting research that it then publicized, saying we have a systemic racism problem, and that they called it the Racial Disparity Review is the name of the report that they released later that year, saying that, and it was all about blacks and whites, and it was that blacks are not they're facing disproportionate or disparate outcomes of punishment in the service. They're not being given the same opportunities for promotion that whites are. They, while being nominated to attend schools or to go to command even more frequently than white officers are, fewer are selected. And so that was what the racial disparities report was about. It implied that it was because of systemic racism, which was the conclusion they were hoping you'd come to. And boy, they've been successful with this. But they didn't make that connection in that report. All of that was happening when I come into command. And after George Floyd's death, there was essentially a green light for left-wing activists to use a bully pulpit to push a political agenda on our services, on our service members. And boy, did my base commander do that. I mean, we heard about racism many days of the week, all week long. And
how many safety stand downs did you have on?
Well, he was conducting a weekly town hall on Facebook Live, and he and his command chief would get on. He was a black base commander. He had a black. This stuff isn't even. I wouldn't even characterize things this way 5 years ago. But as everyone is aware, race all of a sudden matters, and it's a big part of our dialogue. So I'm giving some context here. We had a black base commander. In fact, he was the third black base commander at that base out of 4 base commanders in the recent decade. And so we talk about blacks, for example, not having the opportunity that the whites did in the service. 3 of my last 4 base commanders at that base had been black. The command chief was also part black, but they would get up weekly and have a town hall in which they would discuss our need to correct systemic racism, that we needed to have occasional stand downs, do book clubs. We needed to create initiatives that that we'd report on each week from each of the units to talk about how we were addressing racism and the white oppressor class versus the black oppressed class. And I'll tell you,
creating more racism in a reverse way.
100%. This is racism. It's discrimination. It's illegal in my view. In fact, what I didn't know at the time, but later found out, is that same base commander was calling in all of his white civilian employees at that. He's now a general officer, by the way. I mean, if Space Force wanted to hold activists like this accountable, they go force him into retirement right now because he poisons the culture everywhere he goes. But he
Right.
called the white employees into his office, men and women, to ask them questions about the Trump administration. He'd hold up pictures in front of them, and he'd ask them, what's wrong with this picture? And they'd, of course, not answer. They'd say, we don't know. Why don't you tell us? And he'd say, they're all white. That's what's wrong with this problem. It's a systemic racism problem that we need to fix. When the presidential election was going on, he called in every commander on the base and senior enlisted leader and had his legal team present to give us a briefing warning us about showing any kind of public support for the current commander-in-chief, Trump, in the lead up to the presidential elections, and threatened forfeiture of pay if we showed any support, even to the point of having a Trump-Pence bumper sticker on your car. And
But you could have a BLM sticker on your car, no
but
problem.
you could have a BLM sticker. And in fact, while we were locked down for COVID-19 and in quarantine, because we had a 24/7 space-based missile warning mission we had to accomplish, people weren't even allowed to go to the movie theater, for example, if it was open. But if there was a Black Lives Matter rally going on in downtown Denver, there was special permission that was granted to leave quarantine to go support those rallies. This was all going on at the time that I showed up at the base to take command. Now, this was a big problem. I'd never seen anything like it in the military. I figured at first that surely it's worse here than it is at other bases. I think, frankly, it might have been in one sense. But I started to reach out to other commanders that I knew at other bases and kind of get a report on what they were experiencing. And there was a movement that was afoot, not just in the country. It wasn't just cop cars being stomped on in the country that you saw in the news and flag burnings going on. There was a left-wing activism that was now rampant in the military. By the way, I'd be just as opposed to it if there was a radical right-wing. I'm very conservative, but like if there was a bunch of Trump flag waving rallies or something on the base and in-your-face activism that caused division in the workplace, I'd say we got to knock it off.
Yeah,
that's not appropriate. But this was not only left-wing activism, and it was a Marxist activism, which is something I'd recognized very clearly because I'd studied Marxism a great deal.
Yeah, I was going to say with your in-depth schooling that you had at Maxwell, because you go so far into building a clock on Marxism that I didn't know. All this, all these different things between China and Russia and things that happened and how long ago it's. That's the amazing thing. Like watching Peaky Blinders against the communist and the socialist, and that was back in the 1920s. So this has been around for a long, long, long time that people don't realize, but now it's being indoctrinated into all the different places. And the one thing that blew me away was the run-in that you had with your chaplain.
Yeah. Again, same time frame. I'm a brand new commander. The black chaplain, who's a sweetheart in many ways, he stopped by. I shouldn't say this. He's also an idiot. He's just stupid. I mean, like, heaven help the man. He needed to focus on being a good chaplain. And instead,
but his idea of being a good chaplain was to promulgate the BLM or the CRT stuff.
I've never characterized him this way before, and I want to clarify. What I meant. He had the nerve to sit down in my office for an hour. He came in and said, "Hey, good to meet you. I'd like to know if you're willing to give me office space in your ops squadron so that I can have a place from which to be directly involved with your unit and helping combat systemic racism." And I said, well, and he says, I've got a lecture series called Race in America that I'd like to give all of your unit. He was working in league with the base commander to push. It was a left-wing activism, and it was anti-American, I might add. These young kids take an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against its enemies, foreign and domestic. And you've got a guy that has the balls to come in and tell me that he thinks our founding is racist, the founding documents are racist, and that we need to rewrite American history. And I just said, look, I don't. So I said, I think we need to sit down and have a separate meeting. I was as respectful as I could be. I didn't call him stupid. I never have.
Yeah.
And so we then scheduled a meeting. We sat down for an hour and 15 minutes. My superintendent was there. He was senior enlisted leader. And I asked him to describe for me what he means by systemic racism. I asked for him to describe to me his views on race relationships that he was hoping to solve. I asked for his views on America. And then I informed him that his entire worldview is rooted in politics and political ideology, and I'm not interested in having him teach my service members. I said, I need you to be accessible as a chaplain to every member of my unit because they have confidential reporting in you, regardless of their political views or if they're apolitical, and regardless of their religious worldview. You're a Christian chaplain who somehow thinks that's compatible with your Marxist anti-American worldview of all things. And you're insistent on taking their time to teach them about a political worldview. He explained to me that his mom taught him that all whites are racists. And I says, do you believe that that's true? In fact, this was his answer to my question. I said, tell me what you mean by systemic racism. He said, all whites are racist. And I said, that's just not true, and it's not welcome in my unit. And boy, was he upset about that. But that's what I mean by he's stupid. I mean, he's a grown man, a grown adult, to believe something like that in uniform. He's a captain.
Yeah.
When you work with whites, blacks, Indians, Native Americans, and every other ethnicity, race, gender around you, you know that these people get along exceptionally well. They share a common mission and the same oath. It is ludicrous to assert that one group is out to get the other group writ large in the uniformed services. It's just stupid.
But because you are white, you're guilty. You are a racist. It's almost like being at a fraternity party or at a party, and you get caught with rounded up with a bunch of people, and that happened to be the first time that you ever drank, and they send you to AA, and they go,
right.
Why are you here? Well, because I got too drunk or whatever. So it's because you're an alcoholic. No, I'm not an alcoholic. See, that's the first sign of being an alcoholic. And then all of a sudden step off to the left and go, so how long have you been beating your wife? I'm not a wife beater. Well, see, that's what most wife beaters would say when they're an alcoholic.
Yeah. You know, one of the things I had to point out to him, I couldn't help myself but get a little preachy. I just said, look, you're a Christian chaplain. You claim a belief in Christianity, and in our own text, we've got an admonition to not judge others.
Yeah.
And yet, and that's, you've got this, you don't know the hearts of these men is essentially the underlying principle of that admonition. And yet we're willing to go a step further and a bit deeper into the ideological fantasy world that you're somehow able to judge the microaggressions and implicit and unconscious biases of some subset of the population based on the color of their skin. I said, that is totally antithetical to the very worldview that you claim to be a chaplain for. I mean, if you're saying, well, you don't know the biases you have because they're unconscious, but I know you've got them because of your skin color. I mean, that is just absurd. And
did you point at your boss and say, well, look at the boss, he's a product of systemic racism?
Yeah, well,
the base commander.
Well, as you can imagine, yeah, that's right. As you can imagine, as respectful as we try to be, as much of a sweetheart in many ways as he is in his demeanor and his interaction, you can imagine that conversation didn't really get us anywhere. And I began to be spied on the base, in my opinion, from that moment forward, as I began drafting a written formal complaint to the Space Force Inspector General's office. By the way, I hadn't had any thought whatsoever at this point about writing a book about any of this. I used my chain of command. I had a conversation with General J. Raymond, the commander of the Space Force, for whom I'd been the aide. And ultimately, President Trump issues an executive order in September of 2020 banning the use of critical race theory vocabulary in the uniformed services and in the federal agencies. And we began to experience a kind of sigh of relief from this woke activism that we'd been experiencing.
Just a minute.
For just a minute.
Pause. Yeah.
But, well, there was two things. One, the Biden administration comes in and by executive order on day one undoes all of that. Yeah. But at my base commander seemed unwilling to follow the new executive order. And so instead of doing base training, down days, extremism training and whatnot, white supremacy training, and how to fix our systemic racism problem training, I mean, that was like a constant theme. He even gave over ownership of his responsibilities as base commander to his vice commander so that he could focus on the racism problem that we've got at the base. And boy, I'll tell you, everyone is becoming really sick of hearing about this, but he wasn't interested in obeying the executive order from President Trump because Trump's a part of the problem and that order is now a part of the problem. So he just pushed it down to a lower level and enabled younger officers to host these discussions at their own unit level on a non-compulsory basis. But we were still getting emails all the time about, hey, come read these critical race theory books so we can talk about how to fix racism. I mean, it was incessant.
Yeah.
So that's why I filed a formal written complaint with the Space Force IG.
And how'd that go?
Unfortunately for me, I filed it on November 18th, just 2 weeks after the election night had happened. And the 3-star that fields that complaint, he doesn't interview any of the 24 witnesses I'd listed. These are people that would have both agreed with what I had to say and complain about and who would have disagreed with me. These are people like the vice wing commander, the base commander, the director of staff, the protocol officer. I mean, people that work day in and day out with the base commander activist who I was warning about.
Mm-hmm.
None of them get a phone call, an email, or are interviewed in November, in December. January comes around and January 6th happens. And the next day, January 7th, I received written dismissal of my Space Force IG complaint. And it was at that point that I recognized, if a lieutenant colonel who's in command cannot use the system appropriately, either with phone calls with all of our senior leaders who knew me and my family very well and trusted me as a leader, and the inspector general watchdog system cannot hold left-wing political activists accountable for their activism. We've got no hope of preserving our military as an apolitical entity at this point. It's going to become kind of a one-party bully system. And so I was determined to put out a book about it that I'd publish and hopefully get the attention of Congress and the American people so we could start a really important dialogue. And it has become a very important dialogue. It's a part of the midterms. It's a part of a bunch of others, have picked up the football and been running with it. But I published the book in May of 2021. I lost my command the next week. I went on a podcast to talk about the book. The reason for which I was fired was it was alleged that I was politically partisan while acting in an official capacity, which I deny. Identifying and criticizing Marxist ideology isn't a politically partisan issue, or it shouldn't be. And the fact that it is tells you something about the Democrat
Unless, of course,
Party.
you're criticizing them and they are Marxist.
That's right.
At heart.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I wasn't advocating for a political candidate who is Republican over a political candidate who is a Democrat or anything of the sort. And I wrote the book on my free time outside of my duty hours as a commander. And so I'm fired the next week, and then I'm placed under investigation at the Department of the Air Force level. The Air Force Inspector General's office investigated whether or not I had indeed acted in a politically partisan manner, and I was in limbo for 3 months, told to vacate my office. I was kind of essentially quarantined or isolated on the base from other service members. They were told
like
not to talk with me. And it was a little bit. It was a kindly house arrest, because everything's done with a smile and everyone's nice and good guys around you, of course. But there's a political agenda afoot. Make no mistake about it. And so after 3 months, I requested an early retirement. I didn't have a new job. I was sitting there doing nothing, burning all of my leave, waiting for how hard is it to identify whether or not I've been politically partisan? And in fact, they probably spent a little bit of time looking into it and thought, crap, this guy hasn't done anything wrong. What are we supposed to do with him now? Are we going to have a lawsuit on our hands? I tried. I was tired of it. My family was tired of it. And I thought, I'm happy to help solve this problem. Give me an early retirement and I'll move on, because I'm going to keep criticizing the Defense Department over its current woke push. I'm not going to stop. I'd been on Tucker. I'd been on, many, many big name conservative shows at that point. And they knew I wasn't going to shut up and I was going to be as respectful as I could be, and they wouldn't be able to punish me.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, I requested an early retirement. They denied that they being the Secretary of the Air Force.
No.
Although it's my understanding they had the opportunity to grant it. Congressionally approved early retirement program was in effect. And I voluntarily separated. And so I lost my pension and separated. And I've been trying to stay engaged ever since for the past year.
God, that's amazing, man. I mean, you took a bullet for everybody.
Yeah, it kind of feels good to take a bullet sometimes if it's the right cause, right?
Yeah, I mean, you survived. It's not a
That's right.
it wasn't a headshot. It was a full on torso shot, but you survived. How about any of your peers as COs? Did they look at you getting shot and go, "Yeah, Matt was a good guy. Enjoyed drinking beer with him at the club.
Mhm.
I'm gonna let him take the fall," and they just roll with the program?
I
Or do you?
had a number of both peers, senior leaders, not the senior leaders, but peers and senior to me leaders, and many others reach out to me privately to express support, the same concerns. I'm glad someone's speaking up about this because I don't dare. And that's just status quo. I understand the hesitancy. I understand the need to keep your job and keep the dough coming and feed your family. And but there's a new threat afoot at the moment. It's all a part of the same problem we're facing. But there's been these illegal COVID vaccine mandates now that some service members, some few, about 2% maybe, have decided to dig in their heels and say, absolutely not. It's against my conscience. So many of them have filed religious accommodation requests. You spoke with one of them, Scott Sonny Duncan.
Mm-hmm.
And these people too are on the chopping block right now. And I've had a number of them reach out to me. I'm in contact with some who are very aware of what's going on in that arena. I work with a nonprofit called STARS that is also trying to help some of these service members along and help them in their legal battles over this vaccine mandate. But many of them have shared with me, in answer to your question, that they found my book a year ago. They read what I had written, took a lot of courage to see that someone was willing to stand up in the face of the potential to lose your career, for example, and that they were motivated to take a stand against this shot mandate when it came out, knowing that if people aren't willing to put down their foot, then where does this ever end?
Yes.
At what point do you entirely lose your autonomy?
Yeah.
And so I've been grateful to hear that. And if the book could help some people, it was worth it,
Yeah. Well, what do they say? About 100,000 out of our military, maybe 100,000 haven't taken the shot.
Yeah, in fact, I'm aware now. You might have. Did you get that number from Sonny Duncan?
I heard it on a podcast somewhere. Maybe
Uh,
I heard it on a podcast with you when you were
Maybe, and
interviewing him.
I'll add in more now. Over 200,000 between our active duty, reservist, guard, and government civilians are potentially at risk of losing their jobs. I just got a message yesterday from a colonel who was forced into retirement because of this. I mean, we're losing a great deal of experience in our forces. Scott Duncan's a great example of that. He's been in for 19 years. He's an
Top Gun.
F-35 pilot, Top Gun instructor.
Yeah.
I mean, how can you justify destroying the readiness of your force over something that now 2 years after, 2 years after the fact now. I mean, I get that this was controversial, uncertain. We have to proceed with great caution a year and a half ago, but not
Yeah.
now. I mean, like there's just no reason for the
Too
current
much
stance.
information has changed and has come out about it. But I almost think it's almost that bully, not the bully, but I can't admit that I'm wrong.
That's part of it.
So I'm just gonna go ahead and screw you anyway. Even though I know I'm wrong, you're out of there. And your buddy was lucky to retire because too
That's right.
many other people want to retire, but their command's like, you know what? You're one of those guys. I'm going to make sure you get out with, you'll get nothing and like it, Spalding.
Right.
You're out, and they get nothing, so they don't pass go and get $200 and retirement for the years of active duty and the how many deployments over in Iraq or Afghanistan that they've spent away from their families.
Right.
Yeah, Lloyd and Millie and those
Yeah.
guys. I don't know. It's really hard to look at my son and tell him, hey, I want you to be a police officer or a go into the military like your dad and your old man, and your grandfather and your great grandfather. It's a different animal now. And you were talking about, here's an example that I encountered. One of my majors, who is an FBI agent, he's a reservist, just happens to be, he's black. And I have, so many examples of Marines that it doesn't matter. You're a Marine. You might be white, you might be black, you might be Hispanic. Who gives a crap?
Right.
You're a Marine. We've got that bond. But this guy, during George Floyd, I was mum on it on my Facebook, my personal Facebook page. I didn't say
How dare
anything
you?
one way or the other, right? And the reason is because it's kind of like a cop shooting or something. If somebody gets into that, or is close to us, a plane crash. You have a plane crash, and the first thing somebody does is, I wonder what happened. Oh, he did this, and they speculate and they do all this stuff. And you go, you know what? Why don't you hold on a second? Nobody knows anything until the investigation comes out. So why don't you wait until the investigation comes out? Then you can give your opinion. But in his case, he's a federal officer telling me that I need to get on social media. Right. I mean, we have this private conversation on DMs, and then I just got, screw this. So much is lost in translation. I pick up the phone and I call him. I'm like, all right, Chuck, so what is the deal? Well, by your silence, you are endorsing this white police officer killing a black man. And I go, no, I'm not. What if that was you in a shooting and everybody's calling for your lynching because you are an out of control FBI agent, blah, blah, blah. You just happen to be black. Would you want me on social media saying, hang the guy, throw him in jail, put him on the death row? Or do you want the investigation to come out and find out that this crackhead tried to shoot you and you defended yourself?
Right.
So what do you want? And he goes, well, it's not like that. That's apples and oranges. I'm like, no, it is like that.
Right.
And I used the plane crash analogy, and he didn't get it or whatever. So finally, I wrote this little post to calm him down, said, I don't agree with what happened, but I am open to the investigation. I look forward to the results of the investigation. If the officer is found to be in violation of any policies for the department, by all means, throw him under the bus, that type thing.
Well, oh, sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
I got one. So then January 6th happens, and he's on Facebook and he's on LinkedIn. He has all these photographs of all the January 6th people. Help the FBI identify these insurrectionists. Send us a tip at 1-800 hot FBI tip, whatever. And so I just get on LinkedIn and I go, it would be amazing if the FBI put this much effort into finding the Antifa folks who burned down federal buildings in Portland and Seattle. Oh my God, he got all wrapped up and said, this is, not the appropriate place to get political. And I go, I'm not being political. I'm just stating a fact. Right. You are going full guns after these people who calmly walked through and didn't burn down the Capitol, to the folks that actually attacked federal buildings. Well, it's different. It's the Capitol. And I'm like, all right, I get what they did was wrong, but how about putting a little effort into finding the people that were throwing, basically homemade hand grenades and stuff and shooting artillery rounds. And those things they're dangerous at federal officers. And he didn't like that. So I said, you know what? Do I really want this guy with that level of power anywhere near me in my life? No, I don't. Friggin' block. You're done. Out of there. Block on my phone. I'm not dealing with a radical guy that's in the federal bureau right now. I don't. He's probably monitoring me. He has me labeled as a white extremist military guy with armored vehicles.
Yeah, you fit the description, man.
I probably do. And by having you on this podcast,
look at your skin color, and now you're interviewing me, and you're conservative.
I'm on a watch list. Yeah, I'm on a watch list. It just drives me nuts nowadays. And what do you see for recruiting? Have you heard anything from the Air Force Academy about how their numbers are down, and kids having the not wanting to go into a situation like that?
Yeah, I've both talked to people who are involved in the recruiting process for the Air Force Academy who have told me they've lost high quality recruits in the past year because of concern of what they're seeing about the military in the news.
Mhm.
I've talked to people who have once had interest in attending a service academy who no longer do. I've talked to parents who have kids at the academy who describe some of the challenges their student is facing as a cadet at these service academies. And I recently I interviewed for an hour with Christina Wong of Breitbart, and there was an article that Breitbart just put out about a week and a half ago about the recruiting crisis that the Air Force Academy is facing. And so, I mean, people could see that. And the numbers that I shared with her, this is kind of funny and sad. She reported very accurately on numbers,
Mhm.
specific percentages of qualified candidates, for example, who have applied for admission into the Air Force Academy, because I gave her numbers directly from the registrar's office at the Air Force Academy that someone who works in the registrar's office gave to me. And she puts that in the article, and she got an email from the Air Force Academy leadership the next day. They didn't
Who gave you that?
explain. Well, no, they just said your article is entirely wrong. Your facts are off, or they're not fact. The data is off, and that's it. No explanation of what she had wrong. Um, they just had to set the record straight. You're wrong, and we said so.
Right.
But what they didn't appreciate is that she had the data at her fingertips. She's looking at the registrar's office's information, and so we're facing a difficult problem right now with recruitment and retention. And it's not just our recruitment. That's a problem. It's our retention. And we're not talking about that as much in the press right now. We are
We're
going to
gonna,
have
yeah,
problems retaining high quality folks, not just because we're purging them, but because they are leaving. They're choosing to leave. They can't do it this week and they can't do it next week. But when their commitment's up this year and at the end
yeah.
of next year and the end of the next year, they're done because they're
What
so
about
sick
some
of
of the
seeing us.
exit interviews you had with some of your folks?
Yeah, I interviewed, and just as a caveat, I'm at a hard stop right about now, so
Oh,
we'll try and wrap up here. But I do want to answer this question, and sorry to cut it short. I've just out of my control. I've had
no
some things
worries.
come up I need to jump into. Um, I had both for exit interviews as well as just day to day people knocking on my open door and saying, "Do you have a few minutes? I'd like to come in and talk to you." People again of varied political persuasion, different races or ethnicities, gender, so forth.
Right.
Come sit down with me unsolicited and explain it. Either ask questions, why are we seeing all this stuff that we're seeing all of a sudden, or explain to me uh, how disincentivizing the political agenda is at the moment, because admittedly, regardless of who they are, it isn't what they signed up for.
Yeah.
If we're going to retain people, if we're going to attract talent, we need to demonstrate that our military is dead serious about doing its mission, serving the country, taking its oath to the Constitution seriously, which means defending our country against its enemies, foreign and domestic, and leaving the partisan political disputes to the citizens in the country whose right it is to dispute things about policy. That's not the military's job. And when we start to get into identity politics, we put at risk a merit-based system, the United
Hmm.
States military, that has been in place since its founding. And that merit-based system has made us the most lethal force that the world has ever seen in many respects. And all of that's in jeopardy even now because of of politics.
Yep. Well, look at the new space commander or not shuttle going to the moon.
Yeah,
It's going to be a female of color or whatever, not based on merit. It's got to be a certain gender, color, race, whatever. It doesn't matter. Geez, folks.
that's demeaning too, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, we picked you because of your skin color.
Yeah. Yeah. Not because I was the best at what I did and I worked hard.
Right,
But anyway, you know what? One day I hope that they figure this out because if
right,
not, we're going to have an implosion from within when you have groups that are identifying as this now and identifying as this, and they're all wear the same green, but now you're light green, I'm dark green.
right.
That doesn't work because you know what? We want the best at what you do so that when you're next to me in the foxhole, I got your back, you got my back. We shoot bad guys and we kill bad guys. And that's what our job is there. You know, not to put
100%.
you up in an F-15 because of your skin color and you're the section lead, you go out and get everybody killed because you had failed a bunch of check rides, not because of your skin color, because you're inadequate at what you did, whether white, black, Indian, it doesn't matter. It's kind of like what I use when I teach. And evaluate, can I put my family in the back of this guy's jet?
Right.
Would I put my family in the back of his 737? Well, if I can't say that I would, then,
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. What do you guys call that? A hook? Air Force
Yeah,
guys
a
call it
hook.
hook and a check ride. Yeah. You hook that check ride, man. I'd sit down with you and find out what issues you have and what's going on and try to be as nice about it as I can. But you need additional training. And unfortunately, some people have different things going on in their family and personal lives that it requires a little help. But anyway, Matt, thank you so much, brother. Do me a favor. Shoot me your address. I want to send a card and a coin
Oh yeah,
as a thanks, and your number, because I do get layovers in Boise.
Oh,
and
good.
I'll
Yeah,
come out and buy you a beer.
I'd love that.
All right, brother. Well, listen,
Thanks,
get on to what you're doing. Thanks again for joining me.
Yep.
You have a good one, brother.
You
Hoorah.
too.
Folks, thanks for sticking around. Tall Tales with Taco and Matt, incredible guy. Go back and watch some of his podcasts. They are fantastic. I think you'll enjoy them. Read his book if you really want to find. He doesn't talk about people. He doesn't talk about or point fingers. He basically describes in whole how Marxism comes, how it's infiltrated our military system, our collegiate system, but mainly now the collegiate system within the military, whether it's a service academy or advanced school or online courses. It's safety stand downs. It's everything beating a dead horse. So if you want to create these problems, just keep beating a dead horse. That's all. You're creating division. Anyway, to the Joint Chiefs of Staffs, if you see this, that's my thoughts, and it doesn't reflect anything upon the DOD, but you guys are the cause. You need to fix this so that we have a better defense program to take care of our nation and make sure that our kids grow up serving our country honorably to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, not support and defend Marxism or what your ideology is, and saying that the Constitution was based off of racism. Just stupid. Anyway, until next time, take care. Adios. Hasta luego. Sa wiedersehen. Tschüss. Sheshine. Au revoir. Domo arigato gozaimasu. Tenno shinde kudasai. Ciao. Arrivederci. And I will end with this. Thank you so much.